Reynolds Lewin felt a heavy burden for what had happened. Part of him wanted to comfort Arthur, assuring him that everything was okay and that he was still family. However, another part of him, darker and more hateful, felt that Arthur should never have revealed this to them. From the beginning of Arthur's life, Reynolds had realized that his son was different. Arthur always seemed much calmer and more mature for his age. Even when he behaved like other children his age, his demeanor seemed like the result of deliberate training. From an early age, Arthur's every action always seemed to have a deep reason, a purpose, or a carefully planned plan. A feeling of fascination came over Reynolds as he tried to understand Arthur's reasons for revealing the truth to them. Wouldn't it have been better if Arthur had kept it a secret? What was the real purpose of the confession? Why was it so difficult for Reynolds to accept this fact? Perhaps it was because it went against his own pride, a selfish pride that made him feel as if he had given birth to and raised a rare genius that comes along only once in a millennium. The signs of Arthur's greatness were always there. His unusual behavior from an early age, his inexplicable prowess in combat, and his talent as a wizard. However, Reynolds began to question whether he was subconsciously ignoring all these signs just to preserve his small ego. Accepting the fact that his own flesh and blood could be so impressive was extremely difficult for him. When Reynolds finally returned to the cave, he felt like a child who had just been scolded. There, he saw only Elder Rinnia, an old elf who was hugging something by the fire. Reynolds glanced at the tent where his wife and daughter were, but could not bring himself to enter. Instead, he sat down next to Elder Rinnia. Elder Rinnia noticed Reynolds' presence and spoke without taking her eyes off the bundle of blankets she held. She said that Arthur had left, making Reynolds feel even more depressed. Reynolds sighed, feeling as if he was a child who had just been scolded. When Elder Rinnia revealed that she had known Reynolds' feelings, she reminded him that emotions often conflict with logic. Rinnia stated that even though one may be intelligent and old, emotions can still interfere with the ability to think rationally. Rinnia pointed out that Arthur probably used his emotions more than logic when making the decision. Rinnia continued her explanation by describing how emotions often conflict with validity and efficiency, something that makes humans more vulnerable to pain and harm. However, emotions also make them more connected as a group. After Rinnia advised that Arthur may have taken a big step out of his comfort zone, she handed Reynolds a bundle of cloth, asking that he look after his wife and daughter. Reynolds carefully opened the bundle of cloth and found a baby manna, similar to a small dark brown bear with 2 black spots above its eyes and a tuft of white fur on its chest. As he was shocked by the discovery, Ellie, his daughter, appeared and showed her fascination. In that moment, Ellie and the baby's eyes began to glow a faint golden light, signaling the bonding process. Reynolds was speechless, watching the bonding process unfold before his eyes. Although he had no experience with bonding with mana beings, he knew that Arthur and Ellie had experienced it. Reynolds felt a mixture of emotions, recognizing that it would be good for his daughter to have such a protective creature, though his image of a mighty mana bear on the battlefield was beginning to fade. As the golden badge was engraved on their daughter's right collarbone, the light subsided from both their eyes. The bear-like mana monster stretched out its arms as if it wanted to be carried by Ellie and let out a low whimper. Ellie, cheerfully, picked up the mana monster and named it Boo because of the black spots that made it seem always angry. In response to the name, the mana monster seemed to squirm with excitement. While Ellie was excited to introduce Boo, the father was silent, dumbfounded by his daughter's chosen name. The ferocious mana monster, now looking cute and cuddly in his daughter's hands, piqued his curiosity about the monster's future. Although he felt surprised and skeptical, he couldn't ignore Ellie's happiness. Ellie then ran to Grandma Rinnia to help, but stopped short and turned back to tell her that her mother was awake. The father quickly got up and headed for the tent, which was larger inside than it looked from the outside. With careful steps, he entered the room his wife was in and smiled as he saw her sitting up. He asked her gently how she was feeling and was told that she had just woken up from a short sleep. When he sat down beside her, she complained about how long she had slept, and he put his arm around her, pulling her close to lean on his shoulder. He then asked about Arthur and whether he had left. The wife began to tremble as she received the answer that Arthur had left. In an atmosphere of despair, the wife expressed her guilt for doubting and not taking Arthur's secret seriously. She felt distressed by the fact that she could not easily accept what Arthur said and wondered if she was a bad person for doubting whether Arthur was their son. The father attempts to calm his wife down, comforting her and reassuring her that it is normal to doubt things. He explains that they need time to process their feelings and that Arthur knows about this, which is why he told them before leaving. He tried hard to contain his emotions and be a figure that his wife could rely on. The wife, with dull and almost lifeless eyes, looked distraught and wondered what if their child had not been taken in by Arthur. She imagined the possibilities of what their child would have become if Arthur had not existed. Seeing the helplessness and despair in his wife's eyes, the father felt deep pain and sadness. As the wife continued to lament the possibilities of what could have been, the father lovingly tried to comfort her. He recalled the moments they had gone through together, when they had celebrated, fought, and cried together. He emphasized that the bond they had was more than just the blood that ran through them. It was the experiences and the time they had spent together that made them close. The father remembers Arthur's sacrifice and urges his wife to stop thinking of impossible possibilities. He emphasized that they needed to accept reality and appreciate what they had. Holding his wife close, they sat together in an embrace, letting their tears dry and their pain slowly subside. As the emotional mood began to improve, Ellie appeared from outside the tent with a cheerful voice, offering to introduce Boo. Renia's sister was also heard from outside the tent, directing Ellie to play with Grandma so her parents could rest. Seeing the smile on Ellie's face, the wife finally smiled too, showing that despite the difficult situation, the happiness and support of the family remained. The father, while wiping the tears from his wife's face, continued their conversation gently. He realized how important it was to face reality with courage and love, and promised to face whatever was to come together with his wife and their family. Arthur Lewin entered a land inhabited by beings considered gods by many with curiosity and awe. In his imagination, grand and fantastical lands were always built of gold, diamonds, or other precious materials. In his old world, the homes of important figures prioritized practicality over luxury. These were warriors with simple tastes, and luxurious animal skin furniture was only sought after by wealthy merchants and politicians. When Arthur stepped out of the golden column of light and entered the world of Azura, he was awed by a sight far different from what he had imagined. The towering castle in front of him looked as if it was born from the earth itself. There was no indication that the castle was built by human hands. Sophisticated designs and runes made of precious minerals covered the high walls of the castle, visible from kilometers away. Colorful bridges that arched and intersected formed a corridor leading to the castle entrance, shimmering in various translucent colors. Arthur felt as if he had been transported to another planet, where earth and soil formed magnificent structures worth living in. The sight distracted Arthur from the regret and anxiety that plagued him, at least for a while. The castle, standing on a mountain higher than the clouds, with its two peaks rising like islands in a sea of misty white, impressed a beauty and majesty it was difficult to put into words. As Winsome, the Azura who brought him here, led them across the bridge of precious minerals, Arthur felt a deep sense of tension. The bridge looked half translucent and shimmered like tarnished glass. Although Arthur had never been afraid of heights, this time he felt a strange anxiety. With no supports supporting the bridge, his fear was more due to the uncertainty of what or who might be watching him during their journey. Winsome explained that they would be heading to Clan Indrath's castle, Sylvia's family home. Arthur was surprised to hear that they would be meeting with this powerful lord, Although Arthur found it amusing to see the normally cool and aloof Winsome looking anxious, he followed the instructions attentively. Arthur was also concerned with how soundly Sylvia slept in his arms, her only comfort being her rhythmic breathing. Once they entered the castle, Arthur felt the same majestic atmosphere as the outside of the castle. The ceiling was extremely high, with arches that seemed to be chiseled from the mountain. The walls of the castle were decorated with intricate details, as if telling a long story. Although the castle was huge, it was quiet and serene. Winsome was visibly agitated, constantly adjusting parts of his clothing as he led Arthur towards the intimidating corridor. As they neared the end of the corridor, Arthur saw two guardian figures standing in front of the door. These figures were enveloped in the shadowy darkness of the corridor lights, and Arthur instinctively felt threatened by their presence. In the presence of these guards, the menacing monsters of the past felt like a much smaller threat. As they approached the door, Arthur could see more clearly the features of the two guards. One of them was a woman with a friendly expression on her face and short green hair that looked a little tomboyish. Her curves that were clearly visible under her leather armor showed a different personality. Next to her, a man with sharp eyes and a jagged scar on his cheek looked more fierce. The only visible weapons of the two were the short daggers strapped to their waists. One of the guards smirked at the sight of Winsome and Arthur. The male guard looked at Sylvia with an appraising gaze and asked if a human child was worthy to carry the princess. The sentence reflected disapproval of the situation, adding to the tension Arthur felt in the presence of the seemingly all-powerful guards. After a few moments of looking at each other, the two guards finally gave Winsome a brief nod. They both stood in front of the large and imposing door, each holding the doorknob attentively. The aura emitted by the two guards was powerful, enough to feel it physically. In a few tense seconds, beads of cold sweat began to run down Arthur's face. His breathing became shallow and labored, indicating the tension he was feeling. With great effort, the two guards pulled the towering door open. The door seemed to be very heavy, and the effort they put into opening it was quite evident from the strength they exerted. Finally, with a loud crack, the door opened completely, revealing what appeared to be the Great Hall. Inside the hall, Arthur saw a young man sitting on a white throne that blazed with white fire. The man looked no older than 20, and his appearance did not match Arthur's expectations. Winsome, without hesitation, stepped past Arthur to the throne and knelt respectfully, bowing his head. Lord Indra, who was sitting on the throne, had a cool, almost gentle aura. His hair was a silvery beige color, and he looked attractive in a quiet, albeit unobtrusive way. Arthur felt that Lord Indra did not show any conspicuous physical strength under his white robes. Nonetheless, his violet-colored eyes reminded Arthur of Sylvia, but with a harsher and more stern feel. Feeling that he had stared for too long, Arthur finally followed Winsome and knelt before Lord Indra. Although his head was bowed, he couldn't help but peek around the room. The great hall was filled with figures of all ages and sizes staring at him with various expressions, ranging from contempt to curiosity. The figures around Arthur exuded a powerful aura, enough to make the strongest wizard in Decathlon feel faint. However, Lord Indra, sitting on the throne, did not emit any aura. Even after trying to sense him consciously, Arthur could not feel the presence of Lord Indra, even though he could see him. The difficulty of believing in Lord Indra's existence became a challenge for Arthur. With a soft yet sharp as a knife voice, Mr. Indra ordered them to stand up. Arthur, with Sylvie still in his arms, followed the order and stepped onto the throne. During the journey, he felt the gazes of everyone who followed his every move with keen attention. Arthur felt as if he was going back in time to when he was an orphan and gathering groceries at the market, where he was often met with stares and disgust by adults. Time passed slowly as they waited for Mr. Indra to speak. However, the man simply stared at Arthur and Sylvie with an expression that was difficult to interpret. When Arthur felt Sylvie in his arms suddenly disappear and reappear in Mr. Indra's arms, his reaction was one of astonishment and confusion. With a confused voice, Arthur tried to grab Sylvie, who had been taken away by Mr. Indra. Mr. Indra, in a casual manner, held Sylvie in one hand and examined her carefully. He observed Sylvie's sleep bond and stated that the level was very low and seemed to have strained her. Mr. Indra's eyes pierced Arthur sharply, but his pride kept Arthur on his feet. Winsome, seeing the situation, defended Arthur and offered to train Sylvie if that was what Mr. Indra wanted. However, Mr. Indra firmly declined the offer and said that he would keep Sylvie alone until her training was complete. With that statement, the atmosphere in the hall became tense, and the other members of Clan Indra began to whisper excitedly. Mr. Indra then placed his soft fingers between Sylvie's eyes and said something inaudible. His eyes glowed, and suddenly Sylvie woke up with the same violet-colored glittering eyes as her grandfather. Sylvie looked confused by her surroundings and the stranger holding her tightly. Arthur tried to communicate with Sylvie and asked her how she was feeling. Sylvie, with her eyes struggling to stay open, asks to go back to sleep. Arthur is impatient and asks Mr. Indra about the real reason he was brought here and why the remote dungeon in Decathlon is not used for training. Mr. Indra explains that Arthur is considered an important part of the fight against Agrona and his army. He stated that this kind of training was only given to the most talented of the younger generation, and that Arthur should understand the mutual benefits of winning the upcoming war. Although Lord Indra did not give a definitive answer regarding the timing of the war, he instructed Arthur to focus on his training and promised to inform Winsome when the time came to return to the homeland. When Arthur asks questions about Sylvie's whereabouts, Mr. Indra firmly states that Sylvie will stay with him until his training is complete. Mr. Indra showed impatience and chased Arthur and Winsome out of the great hall. After leaving the hall, Arthur angrily shook his hand from Winsome's grasp and expressed his dissatisfaction at the treatment he had received. Winsome explained that the relationship between humans and Azurus was very complex and could only be summed up as vengeful tolerance. He calmed Arthur down by saying that although the relationship was difficult, Arthur and Sylvie would not be mistreated. Winsome emphasized that Arthur's importance to them would not be overlooked. With a faint smile on his lips, Winsome invited Arthur to leave, saying that there were some people he wanted to meet. Arthur, still feeling depressed and confused, followed Winsome curiously about what would happen next. The instructor at the front of the class projects firmness in his every move. With whip in hand, he made sure that each student followed the correct position. The instructor directed Arthur to place the left foot at a 40-degree angle. The center of gravity should be aligned with the right heel, the fulcrum that supports the entire weight of the body. The instructor continued to circulate around the class, making sure every move was in accordance with the technique being taught. Arthur could only stifle his frustration as he tried to adjust his foot position. Non-compliance meant a delay in dinner. They would only be fed after all students had performed the moves perfectly. Training at the institution included 8 hours of intense combat training, followed by 10 hours of meditation to maintain the ki center. The remaining 6 hours are allocated for eating, bathing, and sleeping. Students who succeeded in awakening their ki centers would be separated into special groups, while those who failed would be transferred, a euphemism for banished. Arthur has adhered to this training regimen diligently, taking 2 hours out of the meditation session to sleep after meditation. In addition, he used the allotted sleep time to discard techniques he deemed unnecessary and practice his own methods. Although the instructors taught brutal and impractical techniques, the essential information about human vital points was the only thing Arthur found useful. Their techniques focused on injuring weak points without considering the opponent's reaction, a method that seemed absurd. Arthur continued to hide the fact that his ki center was already developed well enough to learn ki techniques. He knew that once he reached a higher level, he would have less time to practice on his own. Luckily, Arthur found a key technique book that taught how to hide the user's existence. Although the book was a guide to low-level techniques, the techniques he learned from it gave him the ability to sneak into the library that held all the key techniques. Now, he reflected, the little sleep he got and the great effort he put into learning these techniques might explain his achievement. Arthur learned key techniques by using rough drawings from manuals and was able to understand how to flow ki in the body to execute the techniques. The first key art he mastered was a footwork technique that allowed him to move quickly and dodge attacks with great accuracy. This technique, though seemingly simple, became Arthur's go-to weapon in battle. Arthur still vividly remembers the time he used the technique to defeat his previous instructor, who often whipped him for no apparent reason. The look of astonishment on the instructor's face, the wide eyes and gaping mouth, was a moment he will never forget. Although he earned nicknames like Untouchable and Godspeed thanks to these techniques, when Arthur came to this new world, these skills were almost useless. He had to adapt to new abilities that made old techniques less relevant. Memories from the past often resurface in unexpected ways. When an opponent kicked Arthur's leg and he fell to the canvas, memories from his childhood flashed before his eyes. Down and wounded, his shoulder dislocated by the opponent's sharp strike, Arthur was unable to dodge the attack that destroyed both of his legs simultaneously. Helpless, he could only stare at the opponent who had overwhelmed him, watching as his left arm was severed in the opponent's hands. Arthur felt every second of the pain that ravaged his body. The pain that extended from the cracked bones to the gaping wounds tormented him fiercely. Amidst the oppressive pain, an Asura, who was responsible for the wounds, approached Arthur with a puzzled expression. With a brief nod and a flick of a finger, the Asura said, "Enough," before the world around Arthur faded to black. When consciousness returned, Arthur awoke with all his limbs intact, not amputated as he had feared. Still gasping for air, Arthur crawled on all fours and vomited up the last of his food. The vomit soon disappeared in the small sapphire pool where he was meditating. It was unclear whether his body was wet from the magical liquid surrounding him or from the sweat and dirt released from the stress he was feeling. Arthur felt very tired, but his determination to continue training made him fight on. With his remaining strength, Arthur managed to whisper, "No, let him continue." Meanwhile, the same deep, restrained voice that had broken most of the 206 bones in his body asked about the time that had passed. Winsome replied firmly that about 5 minutes had passed. A thin man with a shaved head, who did not seem to show any sense of disappointment or pride, estimated that the time remaining in the exercise was about an hour. Arthur listened to the conversation with tiresome curiosity, while wiping the vomit from his lips. After the conversation, Arthur sat back in the meditation position taught by Winsome in the center of the sacred pool. The shaved-headed Asura nodded in agreement and sat facing Arthur in the exact same position, signaling Winsome to begin again. The glowing sapphire liquid immediately rose around them, enveloping Arthur and the Asura in front of him. A familiar sensation of heat flooded Arthur's body, one he had felt many times during these training sessions. His vision darkened again as he waited anxiously to see the results of this exercise. Arthur thought back to the previous few hours, when they had just left the Indrath clan castle. Deep dissatisfaction filled his mind after Lord Indra decided that he should not meet or even communicate with his bond during their stay. Lord Indra made it clear that his presence would hinder the progress of Sylvie's recovery and training. Being separated from Sylvie made Arthur feel strange and empty, as if a limb had been removed. Although his bond slept, he could usually still feel her presence. Meanwhile, Winsome and Arthur continued their journey, descending a steep mountain with a drastically changed atmosphere. The colors seemed to disappear, replaced by a bleak canvas of gray stones and weathered wood. The sea of clouds previously seen far below was now directly above them, with the layer of mist looking like the boundary between heaven and purgatory. The downhill journey, which should have taken only a few hours, became hours due to tradition, and the feasibility of forbidding the use of mana magic to descend the mountain. As they arrived at their destination, Winsome announced quietly, without showing any signs of fatigue, in a zone with low air pressure and density. He stared intently at a dead root jutting out of a gap between two rocks. Arthur, exhausted and confused, muttered about whether they would be practicing in such a seemingly meaningless place. Winsome ignored Arthur's question and extended a hand towards Arthur. As soon as Arthur took his hand, Winsome pulled him along, and they were instantly in a small cave. Inside the cave, Winsome led Arthur to the glowing pool he had seen earlier. Upon arrival, Winsome greeted Kordri, a shaved and slender Azura. Kordri, who did not seem to stand out physically or look extraordinary in any way, wore a thin, tight robe. His 4 eyes were brown in color, radiating a calm wisdom. Arthur, having regained his composure, greeted Kordri and heard Winsome's introduction. Kordri was a close friend of Winsome and hailed from the Feist clan, a pantheon Azura race known for mastering neutral-type mana arts. The Basilisk race, which came from the Vritra clan, was the only race capable of mastering the art of decay-type mana. Meanwhile, the remaining 6 Azura races, including the Naga race that Lord Indra, Sylvia, and Winsome belong to, have different creation-type mana skills. Although the Naga race was famous and feared for its unique and mysterious Aether arts, they were still considered creation-type. Of course, the terms for creation-type, neutral, and decay mana arts varied between races, but the author chose to use standardized terms to maintain clarity. At that time, there was no time to discuss in detail the special qualities of each race, as they had already arrived at Elder Rinya's residence. However, the author felt that such knowledge would be further studied later. Upon their arrival, Kordri's voice, which sounded flat and full of worry, distracted the author from her reverie. Kordri, with a worried look, asked Winsome about the Aether orb given by Lord Indra. Winsome then took out a small palm-sized orb from his robe pocket and showed it to Kordri. The orb seemed to glow softly, indicating its special existence. Kordri admired the orb, recognizing what a great investment Mr. Indra had made in Arthur. Winsome then turned to the author, giving him a look that said he told you so, before refocusing on Kordri. He asked Arthur to come over and sit beside them, and explained that Kordri would explain how Arthur's training would begin. Kordri gestured for Arthur to sit down, and then explained the reason behind their choice. According to Kordri, Arthur's body and mana core were not nearly strong enough to handle the kind of training that young Azuras usually do. Without the proper resources, it would take decades for Arthur to physically absorb their lessons. Fortunately, they had Aether spheres that could aid in the training process. Kordri went on to explain that the Naga race was considered the Azura race closest to gods, divine entities. The Naga race has the ability to manipulate Aether, the matter that flows throughout the universe, and has the power to manipulate time and space. The Aether orb they possess is one of the artifacts that allows their clan to gain a glimpse of the Aether's power, including the ability to separate the body from the soul. With these abilities, the Aether orb can speed up Arthur's training process and heal any injuries he may have sustained. Winsome explained that due to the close relationship between Clan Feists and Clan Indra, Lord Indra once allowed them to use the Aether orb on a temporary basis. In addition, they were also allowed to use Lord Indra's exclusive training grounds, where the Aether-rich liquid in the pool would speed up training and wound healing. Kordri, a gifted and respected teacher in the Feist clan, would be in charge of the first part of Arthur's training. When Arthur inquired about what the first part of the training would entail, Winsome gave a sly-sounding answer. Arthur would fight Kordri in a mental state, and in the process, he would die repeatedly. Kordri encouraged Arthur to believe in his body. Although each time Arthur experienced death, the pain and mental trauma he experienced were severe, he had to keep going. When Arthur felt Kordri's hand sticking out of his chest without blood, he felt a very familiar sensation, as if his soul was being sucked out of the soul realm. After waking up in the cave, Arthur immediately felt around his chest, making sure that there was no hole there. He fell on his back in the shallow pool, feeling great pain and exhaustion. In a desperate tone, he asked Winsome how much time had passed. Winsome replied that the time wasted in training was 2 minutes, and the more times Arthur was forced out of the soul realm, the more time was wasted. Although 1 hour inside the practice was equivalent to 12 hours outside, it was not enough if Arthur was taken out every few minutes. Arthur felt that the sensation of death he experienced was very heavy, and the pressure he experienced almost drove him insane, even though his physical body was unharmed. Kordri and Winsome, the two Azuras who were involved in Arthur's training process, had a seemingly ambitious goal. Training a human teenager through such an extreme method was certainly a topic of discussion. Not once did they seem to hesitate or question their decision, even though this training led to unimaginable misery for a novice like Arthur. In this training, Arthur experienced many challenging situations. His physical body and core were in a stage where they had to adapt to the rigors of the training, and although his mental strength was a combination of 2 lives, the process was beginning to take its toll on him. Although he had been engaged in this practice for quite some time, every time he experienced death in the soul realm, he felt a deep sense of discomfort. Over time, he began to feel the physical and mental effects of this rigorous training. At that time, Arthur underwent an intense training process with Kordri. The training took place in a seemingly limitless area, with grasslands extending to the horizon. For 8 days, he trained hard, while every hour in the physical world was equivalent to 12 hours in the training world. From the beginning, Arthur felt that the time spent in the physical realm eating, sleeping, and resting was invaluable. Even after dying many times, he felt that he had spent months in this practice. In this training, Arthur was tested by Kordri, who turned out to be a highly skilled and disciplined warrior. Despite Arthur's combat experience, he was often caught up in Kordri's attack routines. Kordri, with his high level of skill, was able to overcome Arthur's attacks with ease. Fighting Kordri required tremendous focus and concentration, as the same attack patterns were repeatedly executed with impressive speed and power. Arthur realized how difficult it was to survive in battle against Kordri, who not only possessed great speed, but also the ability to make devastating attacks. Many times, Arthur was unable to avoid the attacks even though he knew the pattern of the attacks. Every time he ignored the pattern or made a mistake, he felt a significant impact. Despite dying many times, Arthur continued to try to improve his technique and find ways to avoid Kordri's attacks. Over time, Arthur began to feel that he could survive longer, though not without difficulty. When he faced unexpected attacks from Kordri, such as the roundhouse kick that replaced the usual knee strike, Arthur had to make every effort to avoid death. During this process, pain and suffering became part of the training. Even when his body was magically restored after death, the pain of the healing process was as painful as the injury. Arthur had to struggle with feelings of frustration and patience as he made slow progress, but each time he managed to hold out a little longer, he felt a little better. Kordri and Winsome's training not only tested Arthur's physical abilities, but also tested his mental strength and ability to endure extremely stressful conditions. Although he sometimes felt close to despair, he kept trying and hoped that the suffering he was going through now would have fruitful results in the future. Kordri suddenly proposed to take a break from combat training, and that statement took Arthur by surprise. Given Kordri's specialization in hand-to-hand combat, Arthur was not sure what else he could teach himself. Arthur felt his ability to understand and apply fighting techniques was good enough. Coupled with his stubbornness, he felt nothing could stop him. However, Kordri seemed worried if they continued to train with the same intensity. Kordri explained that Arthur's potential as a wizard beyond anyone else would not help if he continued to push himself in this demanding training. According to Kordri, what he meant was not physical damage, but the psychological impact of intense training. He warned that although the Aether orb did not allow permanent death, the impact of repeatedly experiencing death in training could cause psychological trauma that could hinder Arthur's development as a fighter. Kordri explained that prolonged and intense pain can interfere with one's ability to act effectively and can make the body instinctively try to protect itself, even though it may be undesirable. Such trauma, while not devastating to the body, could affect Arthur's mental and fighting abilities. Arthur pondered Kordri's explanation and began to understand what he meant. Although he felt he could deal with the pain of experience in two different lives, he could not reject the possibility that he might have been affected by psychological trauma. Before Arthur could fully process Kordri's warning, he suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of fear hit him like a tsunami. In an instant, he found himself a few meters away from Kordri with Dragon's Ballad, his sword clutched tightly in hand. His gaze refocused on Kordri and saw the Asura holding a flower with an expression that needed no words. When Arthur was caught off guard, Kordri disappeared without any sign of previous presence or intent, and the searing pain made him duck. Kordri's hand stabbed straight into Arthur's chest, and when he tried to pull away from him, he fell. The Asura withdrew his hand and knelt beside Arthur. With a gentle smile, Kordri said that although the gods might not understand Arthur's real life, his past experiences explained why something like this could happen. He emphasized that relying too much on instinct is not an ideal solution. Although instinct is very useful, it should not be completely relied upon. He reminds Arthur to take small steps, learn, and also forget some things that are no longer useful. As Kordri ruffles Arthur's hair, he remembers his past as an orphan who had to learn on his own from limited information and tools. Arthur realized that, for the first time in both his lives, he finally had a mentor who was wise and strong enough to help him learn. Kordri was a mentor who could guide him, even with Arthur's unique background and potential. When Kordri stood up and extended his hand, Arthur accepted his hand and stood up. Although his body was still trembling, either from the deadly wound in his chest, the excitement for a bright future, or the madness of the experience of being under the guidance of a skilled mentor, he felt a mixture of all three. With Kordri's encouragement and guidance, Arthur felt ready to continue his journey of learning as a wizard. In front of Arthur, Kordri removed the shackles he was wearing to preserve Arthur's own safety. Kordri, as a true predator, displayed his terrifying abilities, and a paralyzing fear slowly spread throughout Arthur's body. He gripped his sword tightly, feeling the cold sweat running down his palms. His legs trembled, and every step felt like crossing a puddle of undried cement. Salty blood filled his mouth as he bit his lower lip, straining to deal with the terrifying aura emanating from Kordri. As Arthur stepped closer to the aura, burning sweat stung his blue eyes, but he still dared not blink. Slowly, with agonizing difficulty, his brain sent the signal to lift a foot and step cautiously into the manifestation of fear itself. Kordri, who was in the midst of tremendous pressure, ordered Arthur to prepare himself. Arthur forced his tense jaw to relax and let out a roar despite having no air to breathe. His teal-colored sword looked dull, as if it itself was afraid. Despite that, Arthur continued to move, every movement heavy and laborious. When Arthur was finally within range of his sword, he launched a strike, hoping to end the exercise in one blow. However, Kordri parried Arthur's attack with ease, as if his sword were a foam stick. Nimbly, Kordri countered with a swift kick to Arthur's face. Arthur could only dodge in time, raising his sword back up and trying to counterattack. Kordri casually turned his face away, making his sword whiz harmlessly near his ear. Kordri complimented Arthur on the progress of his movements, despite the stressful situation. Although Arthur felt a little annoyed that Kordri seemed to have the time to speak while dodging, he couldn't deny that the compliment lightened the burden he felt a little. Arthur began to feel the difficulty of breathing, realizing that he had almost reached his limit. The only thing he could do was make a desperate attack before his sword fell to the ground, and his hands were unable to hold it any longer. With his body limping, Arthur finally fell to his knees, and he choked on the air within the pressing aura. As soon as Kordri's voice was heard, the pressure pressing down on Arthur's body dissipated, allowing him to breathe air freely. During the past month in the outside world, which is equivalent to about a year here, Kordri's intensive training and short lectures had been the only rest time he had. Although Arthur felt that training was the best thing, a sense of longing for his family and friends gnawed at his mind. He felt regret for the things he had left behind and worried about the fate of Elijah and Tessia, as well as the uncertain condition of his family. During the year of training, Arthur could only hold off Kordri's killing intent for a short time before finally falling. He sighed, finally able to form words as he rolled onto his back, asking about the duration of his training. Kordri, in a stern tone, dodged the question and said that duration was not important. Instead, he asked Arthur to continue training, this time without weapons. Arthur was tired but ready to continue. He unsheathed his sword and prepared for the next challenge. Although his body was still trembling, he felt that each exercise brought him closer to the progress he sought. Kordri released his sword onto the grass, arranging it so that it lay carefully before giving an explanation of the training that was taking place. He reminded Arthur that although Arthur preferred sword fighting, and although his sword, Dawn's Ballad, was an excellent tool, hand-to-hand combat remained the most versatile and adaptive form of combat for a mage. Kordri explained that his training aimed to bring out the maximum potential of Arthur's human body. The ultimate goal is to prepare Arthur for the coming war by molding his bones, developing his muscles, and training his mind to its limits. All of this was aimed at making Arthur a strong knight capable of protecting the continent and his loved ones. Kordri points out that although Arthur has undergone more intensive close combat training than other children his age, Arthur's fighting style is more suited for one-on-one duels. In the context of the upcoming war, where the enemies to be faced are Ashura descendants with great power, Arthur needs to be prepared for a situation where he will be surrounded by many enemies. Kordri warns that Arthur will have no limitations in the use of mana during the war, but must be prepared to face allied soldiers or even civilians who may be nearby. Physical combat, combined with the proper use of mana, would be the most efficient way to overcome the enemy, especially if the enemy was much stronger than the wizards Arthur knew. Arthur understood the explanation and took an attacking stance. With his left hand relaxed and his right hand clenched near his jaw, he was ready to continue the training. Kordri explained that the first lesson was about survival, specifically fighting at high speed while avoiding set attacks. He mentions that Arthur's agility has improved significantly, but there is still room for improvement. The next lesson was fighting under heavy pressure. Kordri recognized that the influence of his kingly power, or killing intent, had strengthened Arthur's tolerance, but there was still much to improve. Kordri observed that Arthur's field of vision was too narrow and too focused. When Arthur realized that Kordri was just a shadow, he immediately felt a crushing blow on his back that made him fall forward and swallow a mouthful of grass. Despite the seemingly ridiculous reality, Arthur marveled at how realistic this exercise was. The pain from the grass clippings and the dirt in his mouth felt exactly as he imagined. After standing back up and stretching his back, Arthur complained about the use of mana, but Kordri emphasized that he did not use mana in his attacks. Kordri reminded him that his physiology was different from Arthur's, and despite his restraint, he was naturally faster, stronger, and more agile than Arthur. Kordri encouraged Arthur to continue training by pushing himself towards the instructor. Arthur felt the improvement in his body mechanics from the training he had done with Kordri. When Arthur performed an attack, he felt all his muscles, tendons, ligaments, and bones working in harmony, even though he did not rely on mana. Although his attack was strong enough to stun Kordri, Kordri was still able to dodge at the last second and unexpectedly ducked under Arthur's right arm. Arthur felt the force and speed that threw him off quickly and painfully. As Kordri put his hand on Arthur's neck, as if it was the tip of a sword, Arthur felt the pressure on his ribs. Kordri recognized the power of Arthur's punch and asked if Arthur could do it for a long time without pausing and with only a little food. Kordri knelt down to check Arthur's body condition and admitted that although Arthur's attack was strong, he expended less energy to throw Aether. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Aether got up and took a stance. Kordri praised the energy Aether had shown that day and instructed him to continue training. Aether readied himself, ready to continue this challenging training. Kordri decided to teach Aether some basic principles of hand-to-hand combat. With his sword, Dawn's Ballad, laid out on the grass, Kordri explained to Aether that while weapons such as swords are very useful, hand-to-hand combat skills remain a very important form of combat. Kordri emphasized that in order to reach his full potential as a knight, Aether must understand how to make optimal use of his body in combat. Kordri reminded him that this hand-to-hand training was aimed at molding Aether's body-developing muscles, increasing strength, and training his mind to the limit. All of this is done to prepare Aether for future threats, especially in the context of the upcoming war. Kordri emphasized that Aether's body must be ready to face attacks from enemies, including those with Azura blood, by relying not only on mana, but also on physical strength and fighting skills. Kordri went on to say that, although Aether had trained hard, he needed to improve his ability to fight against higher-caliber opponents. Kordri taught Aether about the importance of fighting at high speed and avoiding pre-planned attacks. Kordri highlighted that although Aether had shown progress, he still needed to learn to fight under extreme pressure conditions. During the training session, Kordri practiced basic hand-to-hand combat techniques with Aether. He showed how the body can become a variety of weapons, such as fists that can serve as hammers or maces and feet that can serve as axes. Kordri instructed Aether to wrap his body in mana and focus on the area where Kordri's palm was. During the exercise, Kordri gave an example of how the hand can function as a whip and the foot can be used to strike with great force. Kordri then instructed Aether to defend himself with mana while practicing. The loud explosion of sound due to the barrier being destroyed threw Aether into the air, and he felt pain spreading throughout his body. As his vision darkened, Aether felt his body being sucked out of the soul realm. When he opened his eyes, he found himself in a cave wet with mysterious liquid, sweat, and possibly his tears. In front of him, Aether saw a boy of about 7 years old who was over 5 feet tall. The child, who had a shaved head like Kordri and brown eyes, bowed respectfully to Aether. Tessia, the boy's name, expressed apologies for his tardiness and showed dissatisfaction with the assigned task, which he felt was inappropriate for a mere mortal when there were many other students in the Thias clan waiting for Kordri's guidance. Kordri introduced Tessia as Aether's new training partner. Although Tessia expressed dissatisfaction in a rather arrogant manner, Kordri emphasized that training with Aether would help Tessia's development and give her the opportunity to use the Aether Orb, a rare honor. Aether chose not to be offended by Tessia's attitude and focused his attention on the training he would be doing with his new partner. Kordri sighed in resignation, sensing defeat. She looked at Tessia, one of her most talented students, and reminded her that Tessia's arrogance could hinder her abilities. Kordri then turned to Winsome, who was sitting on the other side of the pool holding the Aether Orb. She asked if Winsome would be fine guarding the orb with one extra person. Winsome nodded, hinting that one more person would not be a problem. Kordri then looked back at Aether. Aether followed Kordri's instructions and returned to his meditation position in the pool. Tessia, who seemed less than appreciative of the directive, jumped into the pool and joined the exercise. The three formed a triangle in the pool, continuing the exercise in the arrangement that had been in place since the beginning. Kordri explained to Aether that although the Pantheon race had various ways of using what was called mana-type power, Tessia had been training with the specialized fighting arts of the Thias clan. Kordri elaborated that their fighting art emphasizes quick and precise strikes, as well as throws that take advantage of the opponent's momentum and center of gravity. By observing the opponent's weight distribution and momentum, they can adjust their attacks to effectively utilize the opponent's strength, thus saving energy and using their full strength when attacking. Tessia stood beside Kordri in a haughty manner, her gaze full of contempt as she looked at Aether. Kordri continued that the Thyists' clan disciples were forbidden to use mana until they had properly mastered the basics of fighting techniques. He emphasized that their clan's fame came from the deadly and aggressive art of fighting. Kordri directed Tessia to use all her abilities in training against Aether, without worrying about fatal injuries or death. Strictly speaking, Kordri added that Aether was not allowed to use mana, and was only allowed to defend and parry Tessia's attacks. The only form of attack Aether was allowed to make was throws. Tessia was surprised and wondered why the restriction was placed on Aether instead of him. However, Kordri refused to listen to Tessia's complaints and emphasized that he was tired of his whining. Tessia finally shut his mouth and obeyed the order. The fight began, and Aether faced Tessia with determination and vigor. Despite initial difficulties, Aether began to show rapid progress. Within a short period of time, he began to match and even surpass some aspects of Tessia's abilities. The speed and accuracy of Aether's movements improved significantly. Every punch, kick, and throw Aether received seemed to improve his ability to defend and attack. This rapid progress was striking, even to someone who was not trained in combat. Kordri, as a mentor, was shocked and amazed by Aether's progress. Even though Tessia had shown great talent from a young age, Aether was able to persevere and even exceed expectations in a relatively short period of time. Aether's ability to absorb knowledge and fighting techniques quickly, despite not yet fully understanding the fighting arts of the Thyest clan, showed immense potential. Kordri felt a deep sense of pride and admiration, similar to finding a precious gem. Although Aether was still rough and not fully honed, each advance made him shine more and more. Kordri could not help but feel excitement and curiosity about how far Aether's potential could develop. He pondered whether Aether would have the chance to reach his full potential or whether time would be a barrier to his progress. As an experienced mentor and warrior, Kordri had never felt a similar sensation before. Training Aether, while not easy, was a very fulfilling experience. Kordri realized that Aether had enormous potential, and if he had been born as an enjoyyy, he could have become a prominent member of the highest circles of power. However, as a human, Aether had to struggle hard to reach his potential, and Kordri could only hope that Aether would be given sufficient opportunity and time to develop. The past few days were filled with deep frustration and resentment. Aether Lewin, with a constant sense of dissatisfaction nipping at his heels, found it difficult to deal with Tessia, a talented student who considered herself superior. In this exercise, Aether was forced to deal with Tessia's blatant arrogance, despite the strict restrictions imposed on him. Tessia, who was clearly upset at his master's low judgment, along with his condescending attitude towards Aether's race, made the fight even tougher for Aether. Tessia's attacks, although not on the same level as Kordri's fluidity and precision, were amplified by mana, which made his attacks much faster and harder to deal with. In the first attack, Aether almost lost his life, forced to dodge the next attack that came with incredible speed. With fighting experience from his previous and current lives, Aether is able to guess the opponent's movements based on posture and apparent movement, although this skill has limitations if the opponent has no gaps or flaws in his technique. Tessia, although skilled in her clan's martial arts, still does not have extensive fighting experience, unlike Kordri, who has never shown any gaps in her movements. Although Tessia's attacks had gaps, his strength and speed were at a higher level compared to the opponents Aether had faced. Every attack Tessia made the air around him whistle, and every time Aether parried, his arm throbbed with pain. Ignoring the pain, Aether was determined to fight back. To deal with this constant onslaught, Aether had to speed up his skills, reducing his movements to the extent necessary. Otherwise, he would soon be overwhelmed. As Tessia continued to unleash relentless attacks, Aether grew increasingly frustrated at not having the ability to counter the attacks in the same way. He was forced to grit his teeth and focus harder to deal with Tessia. Tessia's pain and frustration were mounting, evident from his constant complaining and nagging. Tessia growled about the weakness of Aether's race and complained about the poor assignment given to the enjoyyy. which left Aether to deal with increasingly aggressive attacks. Time seemed to pass more slowly than usual as Aether tried to survive. His body began to become a canvas of cuts and bruises from Tessia's attacks. The sweat pouring into his eyes blurred his vision, making it increasingly difficult for him to dodge the attacks that were coming at him at high speed. His body began to respond with sharper and more laborious movements. Every time Aether managed to dodge, his body felt increasingly excruciating pain. Aether struggled to find a solution to this difficulty. He was not used to fighting with this kind of intensity, and dodging attacks at a higher speed than usual made him extremely tired. With his speed dropping, Aether had to be ready to bear the brunt of Tessia's growing anger, but he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out. In the midst of his confusion, he tried hard to think of the answer taught by Kordri: conservation and proper distribution of mana and energy. Aether realized that although Tessia's fighting arts were not as refined as Kordri's techniques, the mana power added to her body made her less prone to fatigue. With this new understanding, Aether tried to be more fluid in his movements, going with the flow of Tessia's attacks rather than fighting her head-on. Implementing this idea felt very daunting, given the risk of mistakes that could prove fatal. Tessia, who was also starting to show signs of fatigue, did not reduce the intensity of his attacks. His initially calm face was now filled with annoyance. Tessia's attacks continued to rain down on Aether, though they never slowed down. Aether tried to not only dodge but also find openings in Tessia's attacks, following his movements rather than fighting him. While Aether tried hard to cope with the situation, he failed to execute some of the planned moves in his head correctly. Tessia's attack that landed on his cheek and the kick on his ribs threw Aether off balance. With a stabbing pain and some possibly broken ribs, Aether bit his lip to endure the pain. Even so, he could not resist Tessia's movements or waste energy in vain. Aether continued to fight, trying to become more fluid and go with the flow of Tessia's attacks, while still maintaining his spirit and focus. His determination to persevere and improve in this exercise was immense, even though he had to face tremendous challenges and pain. After successfully landing a fairly powerful punch, Tessia immediately launched her next attack with a right fist reinforced with purple aura. Tessia's sardonic voice rang in Aether's ears, signaling an impending attack. Aether's instincts screamed for his body to duck and protect his vitals, but he realized that simply dodging would not be enough to deal with the next attack. Aether ignored his instincts and used the momentum from Tessia's last kick. He turned his body counterclockwise to face Tessia's fist. With his right hand raised, Aether tried to time and meet his opponent's fist. Time seemed to slow down as Aether's right hand grasped Tessia's wrist. He lowered his body's center of gravity and threw Tessia's arm over his shoulder, maintaining his body's rotation. With the force of the blow, Tessia was lifted off his feet, and Aether used the momentum to push him to the canvas. Aether's throw produced a huge crater that turned the area around them into a scene of destruction. Tessia lay in the center of the crater, blood pouring from his body, with the whites of his eyes clearly visible. Aether was forced to his knees, trying to catch his breath as he felt the pain of his broken ribs puncturing one of his lungs. Although he normally did not condone bullying someone younger than him, seeing Tessia's pathetic condition gave him a sense of satisfaction. In his mind, Aether recalled everything he had learned from Kordri over the years of intense training. He recalled Kordri's instructions on how to capitalize on the opponent's strengths and counterattack with a careful strategy. Aether had to keep moving and exploit every gap in the opponent's attack. Kordri always emphasized the importance of conserving mana and energy in battle. About 4 months had passed since Aether had been in the other world, and thanks to the Aether orb, he had been training for almost 4 years. Although his body was only 1 year old physiologically, he had trained for more than 3 years under Kordri's guidance. During this period, Aether had honed his body, reflexes, and fighting skills. Suze's 14th birthday had just passed, and the changes were obvious. His fighting skills were much more coordinated than before, making his old skills look like scratch training. Kordri had helped Arthur perfect his ability to use mana, but had not taught any new techniques. Arthur didn't know what the Thyists clan's mana arts actually were or what they were capable of, but he didn't feel the need to know. What mattered to him was the progress he had made in physical combat. As the soul realm where they were training darkened, Arthur opened his eyes to the familiar sight of the cave. He stood up and gave a respectful nod to the 4 rookie Thyists clan members. For the first year or so in the soul realm, training with just Tessia had its limits. Kordri then brought in more training partners so that Arthur could fight on equal footing with Tessia and the 3 youngsters of the Pantheon Azura race. Although the 4 of them were not always in the soul realm like Arthur, he was eventually able to catch up with them. They kept their distance from Arthur outside of training, showing their displeasure in helping the lower races train, especially since Arthur had become stronger than them. Even so, they were not allowed to use their abilities to their full potential, in accordance with Kordri's rules forbidding the use of mana for any purpose other than strengthening the body. Arthur thanked Kordri for the guidance all this time and bowed respectfully after coming out of the pool of blue liquid in the cave. Kordri replied with a smile, emphasizing that it was a gift for both of them. Arthur then asked Winsome about the next training schedule, while mentally searching for any sign of Sylvie. For the past year, he had been unable to sense or communicate with his bond, and he used to look for her whenever he was thrown out of the soul realm, but his efforts were always in vain. Arthur sat on the cold, hard floor of the training cave, feeling the sweat dripping down his forehead and the exhaustion that enveloped his body after the intense training session. The cave was quiet, with only the sound of distant footsteps and the echoing rumble of past training activities. Amidst this silence, Arthur felt the piercing gazes of Winsome and Kordri constantly observing him. The 2 Azuras looked serious, and this made Arthur feel anxious and confused. Winsome, with his piercing gaze no less impressive than Kordri's, announced that the next training would begin soon. Arthur felt confused by the statement, as he did not understand the reasoning behind it. Looking at the 2, Arthur wondered if something was wrong, feeling that something was being missed. Kordri explained that nothing was wrong, but the flat tone of his voice and the expression on his face, as if he was judging something, made Arthur even more confused. Winsome then added that Arthur had not shown the expected changes after undergoing the training. Arthur felt his heart pounding at that statement. He wondered what Winsome meant by "has not changed." His focus turned to which cores had progressed from the light yellow entry level to the light yellow final level. This meant he had passed a full stage from the solid yellow stage he had previously undergone before starting training here. Winsome, who often came to monitor Arthur's training progress, should have known clearly which level Arthur had reached. Winsome continued his explanation by explaining that although training under the Aether orb could be very beneficial, such training was strictly forbidden for children and even young adults. The time difference between the 2 realms could cause a psychological impact on someone who was not fully mentally developed. Winsome revealed that even Lord Indra, who was very cautious of the use of the Aether orb, was reluctant to apply it to Arthur due to the risks involved. However, with the limited time before the war, there was no other choice but to continue this training. Arthur was surprised to hear that Lord Indra was concerned about his welfare. So far, his impression of Lord Indra did not indicate that he would be concerned for Arthur's welfare in this way. Kordri added that he himself was against the use of the Aether orb for the same reason, frustrated by the limitations they faced. Even with the help of the Azuras who taught the art of mana to the mages in Alakria, the higher advancement in Alakria compared to Decathlon made the situation even more complicated. Arthur pondered over the statement, and he began to understand the reason behind Kordri's action of not letting Tessia and the other Thyists clan children stay in the soul realm. The only reason why he did not feel the impact of this phenomenon was because of the mature mentality he had been born with. Winsome expressed his gratitude to Kordri for his dedication in training Arthur. He praised Kordri's skill in close combat, which is hard for anyone to match. Kordri explained that Arthur had to be trained well if he wanted to stand a chance against a powerful enemy. Kordri warned Arthur not to be overconfident just because of the training received, given the higher advances in mana manipulation on the continent of Alakria. After saying their goodbyes, Kordri and his 4 disciples departed, leaving Arthur and Winsome in the silent training cave. Arthur sat on the floor of the cave, stretching his body while watching Winsome curiously. He asked about Sylvie's news, but Winsome replied casually that Sylvie was fine, and that no one would dare persecute Lord Indra's kin. Despite his reassuring reply, Arthur felt worried about the situation. Arthur chose not to think about it further and refocused on stretching his body. After months of being in the soul realm, his body had become stiff, and his muscles felt tense. Although his body did not deteriorate due to the mysterious liquid that permeated it, his hair seemed to grow longer than usual. Arthur realized that the opportunity to train under these conditions might not come again, and he had to make the most of it. Winsome then handed over several pieces of parchment containing information from Decathlon sent by Alder. This was the first time Arthur had received outside information during the 4 months of training. Thoughts of a possible war and the preparations made by the people of Decathlon filled his head. Adding to the worry about their plight, Arthur was distressed by the information that the continent of Alakria was more advanced in terms of mana manipulation compared to Decathlon. Despite the training of the Azuras, Arthur felt that this might not be enough if the enemy forces were really as strong as he imagined. He pondered all these things while preparing himself for the upcoming challenge. Arthur often felt that the training provided by Kordri was an inefficient use of time. While the training had the potential to make him a superior fighter on the battlefield, he doubted the methods used. Arthur felt it would be more beneficial if he focused on developing long-range mana skills. Although conjuring was not his specialty, with the disposition of the 4 elements and the amount of raw mana at his disposal, he believed that mastering long-range mana arts that could level the terrain was more beneficial than just destroying enemies one by one around him. However, as a former commando leader, he understands that the biggest threat is not the number of enemies, but rather the ability to lead troops and deal with elite fighters who can penetrate their ranks. In this context, he could not overthink every little enemy. He had to entrust the matter to his troops. Despite his concerns, Arthur eagerly accepted the paper from Winsome's hand and examined the writing on it. The paper turned out to contain an intelligence report from Goodsky, a spy sent by the Vritra clan on behalf of Alakria. The report was shocking because Goodsky, who was previously bound by strong ties, now revealed information about Alakria's political structure. Arthur chose to put his suspicions aside and focus on the content of the report. The report explained that the hierarchy in Alakria relied heavily on bloodline purity. The closer one was to the Azura bloodline, the higher their status on the continent. Although it seemed simple and superficial, Arthur realized that blood purity was an important factor on the continent. On their continent, the difference between the blood of nobles and commoners might not be very obvious, but on Alakria, the difference was very striking. Arthur was willing to bet that the higher the purity of one's Azura blood, the stronger their abilities as a wizard. With a clear division of clans based on blood purity, Arthur could predict a strict hierarchy. Arthur continued reading the report and found that Goodsky had limited knowledge other than the general hierarchy of the elites raised by Agrona. One of the sections that caught his attention was the information regarding the 4 sickles. Arthur wondered if the information about the 4 sickles would make him a target. Alder noted that the scythes and their followers under their command were the highest priority. In the report, Arthur also found important information regarding armored ships built from a coalition of humans and dwarves, as well as towering fortresses around port cities. Alder also wrote about the sighting of a person who might be from Alakria, but nothing else was too significant. Arthur could only imagine the scale of the war, which was not just a war between 2 competing nations, but a war between 2 large continents with millions of soldiers involved. After collecting and reorganizing the pieces of parchment neatly, Arthur handed them back to Winsome. He felt a mixture of emotions within him. The news of the situation in Decathlon made him feel calm, but the new knowledge of the enemy's strength made him feel cold. Nonetheless, his spirit and determination remained ignited. He now had clear goals and targets, and although the challenges he faced were great, he felt better prepared to face them. Aether then decided to start his next exercise. He stood up and straightened his back, preparing to follow Winsome's instructions. As they jumped off the cliff, Aether felt a strong wind blowing around them. To reduce the speed of the fall, he used his mana ability to create a stream of air under his feet. A moment later, they landed deftly in the vast forest. The ground under Aether's feet was wet, giving the sensation as if he was walking on foam. The scent of abundant foliage mixed with the damp odor of moss, dirt, and rotting wood filled his nose. Winsome announced that this was where they would train, and Aether made sure the sack on his shoulder was well secured. After getting permission, they jumped off the cliff, and Aether focused on the next training challenge. Winsome gave him a list of items to collect as part of the training, including squirrel raptor feathers, silver beetle cores, and titan bear claws. Although Aether was skeptical about the purpose of the exercise, he knew he had to follow instructions. Winsome handed Aether a bell the size of his fist and asked Aether to collect the items in the specified order and use the bell to report the results. Poorly equipped, Aether felt left alone in the forest, but he knew that the challenges he faced were part of the training process.